Preprints are serving the anti-science agenda. And apparently the only solution to this is that we must rely on peer review and peer review alone. I've given it a while before responding to this in the hope somebody else would. Nobody else has given a robust response to this remarkably misguided article. So let's do it. So this is an article that was posted on the Scholarly Kitchen, which I'm sure people who listen to this and follow me on social media will know I do have pre-existing problems with. But we'll forget all about that and we'll just focus on this article in particular for now. There's a lot of things wrong with this article, so I'm going to only really go through the main problems. I'm not going to go through line by line. And there is going to be a more in-depth blog post to accompany this, which will have references to all the things I say, because this is going to be a evidence-based response. This is not just my opinion, although I would hope if you're listening to this, you know that's not just my opinion. So I'm going to start with the title. Obviously, the title is incredibly clickbaity and it's designed to annoy people. Brilliant title. It did a very good job of achieving those things. It annoyed me at least. Behind it, the article kind of fails to live up to the title. The article does not actually give any real argument for preprints fueling the anti-science agenda. It doesn't define what the anti-science agenda is either particularly. What it does do is focus entirely on how important and amazing peer review is, whilst basically saying that preprints are complete rubbish and you can't trust anything in them because they are not peer reviewed. Throughout the article, the author does show an incredible lack of understanding. And I don't want to say too much about the author because I don't know David, so it would be assumptions on my part and I don't want to do that. But just reading the post and things I've seen elsewhere, there is a very clear lack of understanding around preprints, publishing. And I raise that point because this is someone who has created a new journal. There's a very clear conflict of interest and bias running through this article. And I think it's worth highlighting that hypocrisy just up front. So with that aside, let's get into the article a little bit more. I shouldn't have to say this to people listening, but it's really important to highlight who benefits from preprints the most. And that is not necessarily society. It is primarily early career researchers. There's a multitude of reasons why early career researchers are the ones who most benefit from preprinting, primarily around this sort of speeding up the process, really, in that it provides a great example of being able to show what you've achieved over your PhD or your postdoc. And when we talk about speeding up, we really are talking 6 to 12 months on average. That's not a small amount of time, especially for people at the early parts of their career, which some really good data more recently showing just how difficult it is to get started in academia and in science. We might talk about that actually in a future episode. But preprints also have enormous roles in public health emergencies. This was shown more recently with the Mpox outbreak, but also sort of the obvious case here being the COVID pandemic, which I did research on this one. During public health emergencies, preprints are genuinely saving lives. Around 40% of early research during public health emergencies is now being shared first as a preprint, which is huge, especially when you consider early on, that's when we don't know anything really. COVID pandemic is the perfect example here. Things were coming out very, very rapidly. The preprints early on looked quite different. They were shorter, as were the peer-reviewed papers. They were shorter. They would sometimes only be one data table, one figure. And it was just things coming out as they were being done almost. And that was really important in speeding up our response, speeding up our understanding, literally saving lives. Now, for someone to say that they don't think we should be using preprints kind of says we shouldn't be saving lives in a pandemic. So that's a strong stance to take, although I would hope no one is actually arguing for that. But these early preprints were not peer-reviewed. Let's not forget that part, which is the main thread throughout the Scholarly Kitchen post. If anything, I would say just that section alone shows that preprints are far from serving an anti-science agenda and really go against the title of that article. I'm not going to retread the benefits of preprints But given that you save lives, that they're really, really beneficial for early career researchers and careers in academia and for society and getting data out there and access to data, they're the only real route to genuine open access, licensing aside. Gold open access is not equitable. It actually makes science itself less equitable to scientists. A lot of people can't afford to pay article processing charges. They're spiraling out of control. It's generated a huge new business model, which coincidentally the author does mention business models in his article, although he blames the business models for peer review being bad and the problems within peer review, which is wrong. A lot of the problems in peer review don't have anything to do with the business models of publishing. What he's trying to do there is to blame predatory publishers and the more shady practices that happen for poor peer review. That is a big problem. And that is a problem that uses peer review to disguise quality and rigor and quality control. But peer review doesn't do any of those things anyway outside of those business models. So again, it's actually a lack of understanding from the author here, which is something I'm probably going to be saying a lot. The blog post presents a highly outdated view that looks backwards rather than to the current moment, never mind what the future might be or should be. And that's a really, really big problem when you're writing a post like that on that kind of platform as well. Scholarly Kitchen, of course, is a place where a lot of discussions around scholarly communication happen. So let's take some of the points more specifically. One of the main points the author seems to have is that anyone can post anything as a preprint. This is a really, really common and persistent myth around preprinting, and it annoys me almost on a daily basis. So the author's specific claim is that nearly anyone can post an official-looking preprint, and that preprints are like blog posts. Now, not anyone can post anything as a preprint. Most reputable preprint servers have at least some basic screening process in place. The screening processes are not peer review. They're not meant to be peer review. They're not meant to replace peer review. They're not really a strict quality control step either. But what they are there to do is to prevent the sharing of pseudoscience or things that look like they're not scientific studies, non-scientific outputs, things that the preprint server doesn't want on their server. So the famous example, of course, is always bioRxiv and literature reviews. bioRxiv do not accept literature reviews. There's always something across social media where someone's complaining that bioRxiv have rejected their preprint, and it's because it was a literature review. So really, those screening processes are in place to make sure that what is posted on a preprint server is science. It also identifies any particularly controversial work that might require closer examination. So medRxiv here have extra screening processes in place compared to bioRxiv. That's because it deals with things that are more clinically relevant. And one of those processes is that if the person screening the work feels like this should be peer reviewed and looked at more in detail, they will reject it from the preprint server. And again, that's kind of to protect the general public from potentially harmful ideas in science and that kind of stuff. But the point is, not anyone can post anything on a preprint server. There are these screening processes in place. And another thing to mention alongside that is that authors who do preprint are still incredibly cautious with what they're putting out there. I wouldn't say there is a good feedback system yet for anyone who shares bad science. There's plenty of examples of people who are terrible scientists, but still have very successful careers, preprint or not. But when it comes to preprinting, I guess because it's still seen as this newish thing, or this thing that not everyone is doing, authors do take a very cautious approach, such that actually they're kind of making a problem that is a genuine problem with preprints. So often when you read a preprint versus its peer-reviewed version, the preprint will lack data sets. So you'll be reading the methods and it'll say data deposited in, and then there'll just be a blank space where the data should be. Supplementary files might not always be full and correct with the preprint. And that's because of the caution of the authors. The authors don't want to be scooped. They don't want someone else stealing ideas, that kind of stuff. That is a problem. I hope it's something that will change sooner rather than later. And that is, or could have been, a genuine point of criticism that the author completely failed to mention. So there you go, a bit of balance from the response to that terrible article. It's also worth, at this point, maybe defining what a preprint is, because of course a preprint is not a blog post. And actually, if this blog post is anything to go by, then the standards are incredibly low, and preprints have much higher standards than that. So preprint, the definition I give people is that a preprint is a manuscript shared online by the authors prior to journal organized peer review. They are citable, they have a DOI, they are permanent records, they can be peer reviewed, and they are shared when authors believe their work is ready for public consumption. Very, very rarely, they are preliminary bits of work, and this is very rare, but the majority of preprints are complete scientific articles. That's important because preprints can be peer reviewed. The author seems to assume none of them are. It's a very low number. It's about 2%, at least of bioRxiv, medRxiv preprints, are associated with a peer review. But they are permanent records. They are citable. They should be used. Indeed, anything you read that informs your thinking should be cited and used. And I just want to go back to that thing about preprints being preliminary work. This again is quite a common thing I hear, and when I see other people giving talks who aren't as familiar with preprints, one of the things they quite often say when they're giving the definition of a preprint is that a preprint is a preliminary bit of work. I've looked into this. This will be linked in the post we write to go with this episode. It is very rare that a preprint is actually preliminary work. Caveat to that being, it's very hard to identify those kind of works. We tried a few methods of doing that, but as someone who reads preprints and is or should be an expert in this, the whole preliminary part, it's not true for the overwhelming, I'd say 99% of preprints. In fact, most people submit a preprint when they're submitting their manuscript to a journal. So either what you're saying is most manuscripts submitted to journals are preliminary work that need a significant amount of investment, or they're complete scientific manuscripts. You can't really have it both ways. And so this idea that they're blog posts, that they're preliminary, that they're just not good quality or anything can be a preprint is just flat out wrong. I haven't got a nice way of saying that, actually. That is just, it's wrong. We also have to look at comparing preprints to the published literature. This kind of is starting to get at the main thread the author wants to make, which is that peer review is the gold standard and best thing we have for protecting the literature. As you will know if you listen regularly or if you follow anything I do, I have done this kind of work myself. During the pandemic, I authored work comparing pandemic preprints and non-pandemic preprints to their published versions. I'm not the only one. There's a pretty big growing body of evidence from multiple independent groups using a variety of different methods. The important part is they all consistently draw the same conclusion, and that is that preprints are comparable to the peer-reviewed literature. The simplest way I can put that is that peer review does help make an article better, and if you want a number on that, it's about 5% better. Peer review will typically reduce confidence intervals. It can catch mistakes. It's not very good at catching mistakes, but it can. But also, this is a system that costs about $4 billion globally, and it delays scientific progress on average by 6 months. Often that can be a lot longer than 6 months. So that 5% better is something we really need to have a genuine discussion over whether that is worthwhile. When I say preprints are comparable to the published literature, that doesn't make preprints better, it doesn't make the published literature better. It really is that they're comparable. If you have a problem with preprints, you have the same problem with the published literature. The difference I always draw, and I think it's a really important difference, is that peer review does, whether we want it or not, act as a stamp of approval. It's taken by certainly non-scientists, or sadly, it's also a lot of scientists, will rely on peer review to say this work is correct, this work is reliable, and we'll get onto it, but that peer review does not achieve those things. Whereas preprints are very clearly labelled as not peer-reviewed. People are a bit more cautious when they use preprints. There's some good data around how journalists have adapted to using preprints. And so I always argue that actually that stamp of peer-reviewed approval and validity is more dangerous than something that is not peer-reviewed, because we do not communicate. And this guest post, I guess, really highlights the lack of understanding, even among scientists and supposed science communication experts around what peer review is and is not doing. I get a little bit of a reputation, I think, now for being against peer review, and I'm not. But when you get this kind of a post appearing and it's not an uncommon way of thinking, I think you have to take quite a strong stance against what peer review is being held up as, whilst trying to explain what it actually is. Peer review is brilliant for the authors of work. It's nice to have people read your work, but also it does improve work. My work has been improved by peer review. Has it improved fatally flawed work? Possibly. I'd guess for the most part, probably not though. I would also say that because it does improve the work, it's not invaluable, it's not worthless. We just need to make sure that we understand what it is doing. Peer review is not protecting the literature. It is not detecting gross defects. It's not designed at all to detect fraud. And the problem with predatory publishers and the use of AI is that these really highlight the problems with peer review. A lot of people like David here would like to blame predatory publishers for a lot of bad practices. And they do a lot of bad practices. They make the problem way worse. But the big problem really is that they're exposing the limitations of peer review. And that's something I think the whole space is kind of struggling to actually come to terms with. AI in particular, it's not just predatory publishers that are publishing absolute nonsense that are coming through AI. It's highlighting that the problem is widespread. Nature last year with the AlphaFold stuff, they went against their own peer review policies in order to publish work that was headline grabbing. So the journals themselves also abuse the system. That's an entire hour-long talk. If anyone ever wants me to do a talk on peer review, feel free. I'm happy to do it. So I'm not going to go any more for that, but it is worth highlighting that this is not a quality control system as much as people seem to think and want it to be. But given that preprints are comparable to the peer-reviewed literature and some of those flaws, it is anti-scientific to suggest that all or even most preprints would be low quality or nothing more than a glorified blog post on a social media platform, which is the wording used in that article. One question does remain, and it's a genuine important question. About 70% of preprints on bioRxiv are eventually published. So what about that other 30%? This is a question that has persisted for years now, and there's no evidence to tell you anything about that 30%. I do have an active project to try and address that question. I just don't have the support needed to actually realize that yet. But if anyone wants to collaborate, give me a shout, let me know. Now, I think anyone who is an expert on preprints will probably answer this in the same way that I'm going to. So if 30% of preprints are not published, are they a problem? And I think the answer is no, broadly speaking. There are many reasons why a preprint might not be published, and these have got absolutely nothing at all to do with the quality of the work. It could be that the preprint is negative data or it's a small one-off data set. These are very difficult to publish, and they're also not often worthwhile trying to publish for the authors. They've got scientific value, which is why preprinting these kind of things is really good. But a journal and, again, coming back to article processing charges, all of that effort is probably not worthwhile doing. That's also true for negative data. Negative data has a huge scientific value, but the publishing industry does not want that. I gave the example of Nature wanting things that are headline grabbing. Negative data is not headline grabbing. And so it's not worth the effort and the costs to publish that kind of stuff. When you've got a preprint for free, you can write it up as it is, you can put it out there. Negative data, of course, is a harder thing to deal with because it's a lot harder to prove something that is negative. But it's an avenue for getting that data out there at least. The other thing, and I've done this, we've had someone on this podcast in the past who's talked about this, preprints might actually be the final destination for the work. Stefano talked about this when he came on the podcast a couple of years ago. We did this with our COVID work originally. We couldn't afford the processing charge. I was a postdoc leading that work, which is a weird situation to be in. But that meant I had no access to funding to pay those fees. Now, in both those papers, it turned out that we were able to publish them because other people were covering our APCs, which were very, very kind of those people. But none of those reasons are that preprints are low quality or unreliable. There will be unreliable, low quality preprints. The one everyone goes to as an example is it's the preprint that suggested the COVID spike protein was similar in structure to HIV. This is a really good example because it was also withdrawn within 48 hours, which is much quicker than any journal would retract an article. This point also applies to peer-reviewed literature though, and as I've already said, I feel that is in many ways more dangerous. There's always going to be rubbish out there. There's only going to be a certain amount of unreliable stuff. I suspect as preprinting gets more popular, this will become more of an issue, and we will have to find ways of responding to that. Peer review, though, is not the lone answer. The author also suggests that reporting on preprints is alarming. Again, it's a very common trope that gets put out against preprints. I've already mentioned that there is data on this now that shows journalists have adapted pretty well to preprinting. And they actually report on preprints in an ethical, appropriate manner and with greater standards than that blog post uses. So the journalists are doing a really good job of reporting about preprints. And I just want to come back to this notion that peer review is a gold standard. That's the only thing stopping rubbish being posted. Peer review was not standard in biosciences until the 1970s. Before that, most stuff that was published was not peer reviewed. Yes, there was an editor reading over things. Editors are not doing peer review. So in many ways, I don't see why that is any different to posting a preprint. And I want to come back to this because this is an argument I've been having with people on Reddit a lot lately. Some really big foundational papers were not peer reviewed. The example I like to use is the DNA double helix paper from Watson and Crick. That was not peer reviewed, which surprises quite a lot of people. It was actually sent to Nature because at the time, Nature was a place for rapid turnaround, if you could believe that. And so the authors thought they could get it into Nature really quickly, get it out. And actually I think it was less than 2 weeks between submitting and actually being in print. But this really does sort of highlight this misunderstanding around what peer review is doing. One thing that really is fueling the anti-science agenda is this veneer of trust of peer review, as I keep mentioning. And there's a couple of really good examples of this. The best example, however, right now is this public health journal, I can't remember what it's called, from a lot of the people who were against a lot of the actions taken during the COVID pandemic. So you've got John Ioannidis on there, you've got Jay Bhattacharya on there. The fact that he's running the NIH is remarkable. But that's a really good example of using the veneer of peer review and actually a lot of open science principles to mask bad science or pseudoscience. If you slap peer review on it, it must be true. And this happens with a lot more than just the stuff that will be published in that journal. It's just a really good current example to use. You don't have to look very far to find examples where peer review has had massive failures. The Surgosphere scandal, the stuff that's going on in Alzheimer's research at the moment, they're just two, again, recent big examples. And it's not necessarily a failure in peer review, although I've just worded it as that. It's a failure in understanding what peer review is doing. It sounds very repetitive, but it's such an important point to keep hammering back. I do think there is an answer to this, and coming back to that notion that as preprinting becomes more popular, we will start to see problems with quality, or we're likely to start seeing quality problems. What we need is a completely new system of figuring out how to trust an individual research article, and it should work on that individual article level. We cannot use journal names, we can't use impact factors. All these bad proxies are useless, absolutely useless for knowing whether you can trust a bit of your work. I appreciate everyone in science seems to love that you can just use these things. I don't know why it doesn't sink in that you can't, but there's enough evidence now to tell you cannot use these things. So I like the ideas that Richard Sever put forward in his 2023, I think, PLOS Biology article about history of publishing and where the future might lie. And it's this idea, if I can get it published, I'm also writing an expansion of that kind of thinking. But it's this idea of a constellation of trust signals. Peer review, it benefits authors. It can also benefit readers if it's a good, detailed, in-depth peer review. The presence of a peer review, though, should be a trust signal. It tells you someone else has read the work. Assuming they've done a good job, then it adds to trust. But it should not be the only trust signal because it's so deeply flawed and problematic. We need a group of different trust signals together. Now, in my system, that would be sort of a two-tiered layer of trust signals. One would be all the stuff that authors could do. So these are the things that you would have at the point of sharing the work. And I'm talking about data deposition, really good protocols rather than just methods, reusable data, conflict of interest statement, limitation statement, funding statements, all these things that you can and should do when you first shared work. These together add trust one by one. On top of that, you also need the sort of dynamic signal of trust, which is context, which is really important, context-dependent citations. How are other people citing that work? What's the context of social media posts about that work? Some people use social media to actually do peer reviews now. Have there been any withdrawals? Have there been expression concerns? What kind of reference list does the article have? If the article is citing a whole bunch of retracted articles, that's a red flag. Now, it might be that article is about retracted work, in which point you're going to have to cite those things. But for the most part, a normal bit of science shouldn't be citing a huge amount of retracted literature. All of these things, and there's way more that I'll discuss if this article ever actually appears, together function as a trust signal. And that's really the thinking I believe we should be moving towards. That might work, it might not work. It's one of a number of ideas. But what I do think is very clear is that peer review alone is not the right way forward. I work a lot with people who are pushing the publish, review, curate narrative. I hate it. I think it's just a complete replication of all the problems we currently have in a slightly different format. It's not really something I view as a step forward. But we'll also have a whole episode about that at some point in the future. The author of the post also suggests that preprint feedback isn't happening because he cites a single study that suggests only about 7% of bioRxiv, medRxiv preprints have comments. I don't know why he cherry-picked that thing to focus on. Other studies, and there's more recent data that suggests about 60% of surveyed authors actually do receive feedback on their preprint, 70% of who actually actively seek feedback. The problem is that's done privately. So the author is, again, wrong, but this would suggest there is a decent amount of feedback occurring with preprints. It just happens privately, which is great for the authors. It would be nice to see that publicly, but again, if you have a wider range of trust signals, that's one of those trust signals. The big issue really is that in its current form, scientific publishing is just not sustainable. And we can't just change the publishing system. We can't just change peer review. This all needs to be done in a much broader effort. So we need to change how we publish and share work. We also need to change how we decide what's trustworthy and not. We need to change researcher assessment and hiring and promotion practices, and also broader science communication. Basically, there needs to be a massive change within academia itself to move away from this very narrow, blinkered view of everything towards a more holistic approach. Until that happens, we're going to be stuck in this situation. And I don't think that's good for anyone. It's definitely not good for society. In the current misinformation, disinformation climate, it's really important that we have higher standards in academia from scientists. There are a lot of people in science who are purely career driven and they don't care if they put rubbish out. They don't care if what they say literally kills people. And we saw this during the pandemic. All they care about is getting their name out there, getting themselves ahead. That should not be allowed to happen in academia. Medical doctors cannot just go around bringing disrepute to the profession. They can't say things that would cause harm to people. And I think, at least in the biosciences, that should also be a thing. You should not be allowed to do that. So alongside all this much broader change, I think we also really need to actually professionalize academia finally and bring it into the 21st century. But again, that's an entirely other episode. And I think I've kind of covered the main parts of that horrible article. The only thing to say is that all of the things that I've just said are my own view. Sadly, I don't represent the view of any other organisation. If you listen to this regularly, you know where my expertise is, and you know how long I've been advocating for preprints and researching on preprint use. So I would hope my opinion is an expert opinion. The article, if you go along with this, will be referenced so you can see the evidence I'm referring to. If you have any problems with my response, feel free to get in touch. If you enjoyed listening, then hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to rate us on Spotify. Until next time, have a good week.